I can't believe it's taken me this long to play Sekiro. I'm a huge Dark Souls fan. I discovered the game in 2013, instantly got hooked, and put a lot of hours into it. I played both Dark Souls 2 and Dark Souls 3 extensively upon release, so when Sekiro was announced as From Software's next title, I was very, very excited. But, life happens. There was always one excuse or another, and I just never got around to it. But this year, I actually made an early New Year's resolution to play more video games, because I haven't really been playing much of anything for a few years now, and I really miss it. Somehow, I managed to avoid seeing basically any spoilers about Sekiro after it first came out. I knew for absolute sure that this was a game I was going to eventually play no matter how long it took, and I really wanted to go in totally blind. So I went out of my way to not watch any videos of the game after it came out. Finally, back in September, I started my first playthrough, and man, was it a journey. This was my experience playing Sekiro: Shadows Die Twice for the first time in the year 2021. Now, before I get started, it probably goes without saying, but this video is going to be full of spoilers. A lot of the stuff I'm going to talk about is just kind of about the game's mechanics and the way certain things work and how I felt about the game overall. So it's not like the entire video is one giant spoiler, but there are definitely going to be certain moments of the game that I will spoil. So I'll put spoiler warnings on screen before that's about to happen. So before anything else, let's talk a little about
difficulty.
Everyone knows that From Software has a reputation for making really hard games, and I have mixed feelings about that. I've been playing From Software games for a pretty long time now, and I think I'm decent at them. My personal feelings about Dark Souls specifically are that, honestly, they aren't really hard games. At least, not in a vacuum. They just have the old game design philosophy of not trying to intentionally protect the player from failure, and that makes them feel really hard in comparison to modern games. Think about some of the most popular AAA franchises that have dominated mainstream gaming in modern times. Series like Assassin's Creed or Call of Duty. Most modern games nowadays have a few specific features or mechanics in common that are specifically designed to make it as hard as possible for the player to die or otherwise fail. Arrows that constantly point the player in the direction of their next objective. The ability to regenerate health if you avoid taking damage for a few seconds. Invisible walls that prevent you from walking off cliffs and falling to your death. Dark Souls doesn't do any of that. From Software doesn't subscribe to the apparently widely held belief amongst video game developers that dying equals not fun in video games. Instead, From Software games are built around the idea that failing, learning from your mistakes, and ultimately overcoming challenges are part of the experience of playing the game, and furthermore enhance that experience through a feeling of accomplishment when you conquer something that you've been struggling with for a while. Now, I'm sure some of you have already started rolling your eyes, so let me just clarify. All I'm doing here is stating what I believe to be simple facts. I'm not saying that Dark Souls is inherently better than Assassin's Creed or Call of Duty because of its different design philosophy, or that From Software fans are somehow better, more intelligent, or more cultured than people who think their games are too hard or just don't enjoy them for any other reason. I never judge people for the things they enjoy, and people can play games however they want. But there's been a debate going on for a while now about From Software and whether or not the level of difficulty they give their games is fair, and this debate was never stronger than in the first few weeks of Sekiro's release. One side argues that From Software's games are gatekeeping players by presenting an entry barrier that is too high. One particular angle I've seen from this side of the fence talks about how gamers with disabilities may literally be incapable of playing a game like Sekiro with the level of speed and precision necessary to succeed due to their disabilities. The other side of this debate talks about how not everything needs to be for everyone, and that video games are an artistic medium just like art, music, or films. These people often argue that if director Hidetaka Miyazaki feels that Sekiro needs to be as difficult as it is in order to maintain the integrity of his artistic vision for the game, he shouldn't have to compromise that. Personally, I see both sides of this debate. Ultimately, I do believe that at the end of the day, not everything needs to be for everyone. Video games are art, and art doesn't need to cater to every single conceivable audience or demographic. As an artist myself, I believe that artists first and foremost should make art for themselves, and the desires of their fans should be secondary to whatever the artist needs to do to feel creatively fulfilled. However, I'm sure there are indeed differently abled gamers out there who were really excited to play Sekiro and really wanted to enjoy it and simply weren't able to. And that sucks. I'm not going to pretend to have a solution for this dilemma, and I'm sure there are much smarter people than myself who have talked about it at length. And besides that, I don't really have much of a horse in this race anyway. I don't have any disabilities, so I don't really feel like I have much of a right to weigh in on that perspective. And while I'm a huge From Software fan, I am also an adult, so I don't care if people dislike From Software games, because my sense of self-worth is not wrapped up in the things I enjoy, and whether or not other people agree with me about enjoying them. One thing I will say is that right after Sekiro released, I read a lot of tweets from people I follow talking about the game, and the reactions were, pretty much without exception, split completely down the middle, with everyone seemingly having only one of two possible reactions. Everyone I know or follow that is an avid Dark Souls fan said, "Sekiro is amazing, it's a masterpiece, it's everything I was hoping for and more." Everyone I know or follow that isn't an avid Dark Souls fan said, "This game is really good, but it's too hard, it feels unfair." And, I don't know, do with that what you will. I thought it was kind of funny. If you're a Dark Souls fan yourself, you'll remember that while we were all excited when Sekiro was announced, a lot of us also started to get more and more nervous the more we learned about the game. Miyazaki made it quite clear in multiple interviews that while it was still going to be a From Software game with their distinct design philosophy, Sekiro was going to be a very different game from Dark Souls. One of the biggest changes we learned before Sekiro was released was that there would be no direct multiplayer. Dark Souls' combined co-op/PvP system is one of the biggest things that makes the game unique, and for a lot of players, endgame level PvP is where a huge chunk of the extensive replay value comes from. The other huge change was no character customization. Another element of Dark Souls that a lot of players, myself included, are really into is Fashion Souls. The deliberate, painstaking process of finding the perfect combination of pieces from various different armor sets to create a character that looks as cool as possible. This concept isn't unique to Dark Souls either. It's something people get really into for any RPG that allows it, and it was profoundly disappointing for a lot of us to learn that we wouldn't be able to do it in Sekiro. But the thing is, once I actually started playing the game, it took me almost no time at all to realize that I didn't really care about any of the stuff that was missing. When it comes down to it, the game is just so damn fun that I didn't even really notice any of the stuff that I thought I would be yearning for. If you've never played Sekiro, the best way I can describe it is that the gameplay feels like a combination of Dark Souls and Assassin's Creed. You have a very high degree of control over your character during combat, and you need to play reactively to learn the attacks and patterns of the game's various enemies to fight them with confidence, just like Dark Souls. But the combat is also incredibly fast-paced, and movement is a huge deal. Running, jumping, climbing, using the grappling hook, not to mention the ever-present option to use stealth. These things are all reminiscent of Assassin's Creed or the Batman Arkham games. I really can't overstate how good just playing the game feels. Aside from maybe Super Smash Bros. Melee and Project M, I don't think I've ever played a video game where I felt like I had so much freedom to do whatever I wanted in any given moment as I do in Sekiro, both in a micro and macro sense. When you're faced with enemies, there are a tremendous number of ways that you can approach any given encounter. You can use stealth or attack head-on. When fighting, you can use your sword or fight with a very large variety of prosthetic weapons, which are special implements built into Sekiro's mechanical arm. There are a lot of prosthetic weapons to be acquired in the game, and all of them can be upgraded multiple times to give them new abilities. There are also combat arts, which are special abilities that allow you to perform unique attacks. On top of this, you also acquire plenty of items that you can use to give yourself temporary stat boosts or more options in combat. And even if you ignore all this stuff, just the basic swordplay has so much freedom. You can attack, guard, parry, dodge, jump at any given moment, and all of these actions can either be cancelled into one of the others or combined with something else. All of that stuff I just described is what I think of as micro elements. In a macro sense, one of the things I quickly realized while playing Sekiro is that the game almost always gives you the ability to just run away. If you're getting overwhelmed in combat, you very frequently can just use your grappling hook to escape to somewhere safe, or simply turn heel and sprint away from the encounter. The game even allows you to do this during the majority of mini-boss encounters. For the most part, the only time you're ever truly blocked from exiting the area you're in are during major boss fights. At almost all other times, you have complete freedom to move about the game world as you see fit, even if you're in the middle of a battle. This kind of freedom also opens up multiple opportunities to get the drop on not just basic enemies, but even mini-bosses using stealth. Sometimes mini-bosses are shoved into areas where you essentially have to fight them head-on, but most of the time, if you play it correctly, you can sneak up behind them or from above and get an early death blow. This essentially halves their total health, since most mini-bosses need 2 death blows to kill. One of my favorite things in video games is when a game allows you to use its mechanics to their full extent, even against the most powerful enemies in the game. There's nothing less satisfying than leveling up your character to the point where you feel really powerful, only to be confronted with a boss that arbitrarily can't be affected by some of your weapons or abilities just for the sake of making them harder. This is a consistent theme that I noticed throughout all of Sekiro. Nothing in the game ever feels arbitrary. Every design decision feels absolutely deliberate, and yet the world somehow feels completely natural, never artificial, fake, or overly video gamey. I'll explain one of the best examples of this. Something I always liked about Dark Souls is that it doesn't use invisible walls to prevent you from walking off a cliff and falling to your death. Most modern video games make it so you can't just walk off a ledge and die, but in Dark Souls, if you're standing at the edge of a cliff and wondering whether you'd survive the fall, you can just find out. I was initially surprised to discover that Sekiro actually doesn't do this. It doesn't exactly use invisible walls, but it does prevent you from simply walking off ledges of a certain height. It actually took me a little while to notice this because it's very natural and subtle. With smaller heights, you can just drop from platform to platform like it's an oversized staircase. But with big drops, the game will stop you once you get to the edge. The thing that actually made me notice this was the trees. Sekiro has a lot of trees, and they are one of the most common anchor points for traversing levels with your grappling hook. It took me a little bit to notice, but I eventually realized that whenever I was standing on a tree branch, the game wouldn't let me just walk off of it. At first I thought, that's weird. From Software games never do that. But just as soon as I had that thought, I understood why they did it. I couldn't help but think back on all of the grappling and jumping I had already done, and imagine how easy it would have been to just fall off the various ledges due to how fast the game lets you move. Trees are one of the most convenient vehicles for stealth in Sekiro. Imagine how much frustration I was saved from by the little invisible walls that prevented me from accidentally walking off a tree branch while I was trying to be stealthy and alerting the enemies below to my presence. This is what I mean when I say nothing in Sekiro feels arbitrary, and by that same token, the game's mechanics never get in their own way. One of the best examples of this is the fact that between basic swordplay, prosthetic weapons, and combat arts, the game offers a tremendous number of options for how you can approach combat, but you don't actually need to use any of them except for the sword. Much like Dark Souls or Bloodborne can be beaten using nothing but your character's bare fists, Sekiro can also be completed without using almost any of the advanced skills and just by relying on your sword. The amount of abilities and prosthetic weapons in the game more than made up for the lack of traditional character customization in my experience, but you also aren't forced to use any of it. There are a small number of enemies that do need to be attacked in specific ways to be beaten, such as the wooden shield-wielding soldiers, whose defense can only be broken by using the heavy attacks of the shinobi axe prosthetic. But these are few and far between. The only mechanic the game really forces you to use at any point is the grappling hook, but that's honestly about as integral as walking or jumping in this game, and it feels so smooth and easy to use that it's hardly even worth mentioning. Another perfect example of Sekiro's mechanics not getting in their own way is how the game handles water. Water is often very frustrating in video games. Water levels are infamously annoying across the entire medium, and most of the time, having to navigate water in a game that primarily takes place on land is simply not fun. But Sekiro makes it incredibly easy with a few key decisions. First of all, it allows you to, in a way, sprint while swimming. Just as you can hold down the dodge button to start sprinting while on land, pressing the dodge button in water makes Sekiro surge forward, covering a fairly large distance quickly. You can do this repeatedly to move through the water really fast, and because there's no stamina bar in this game, there's no limit to how many times you can do it. Later on in the game, you also acquire an ability called the Mibu breathing technique, which allows you to dive underwater and also hold your breath indefinitely. I absolutely love this because can you imagine how annoying it would be in a game like this if you had to come up for air after a certain amount of time? Every design decision in Sekiro works towards the goal of giving you unfettered freedom of movement, and the way that you interact with water is totally consistent with this. It would have been very easy for the developers to add a breath time limit like lots of games do, but it simply wouldn't have made sense for a game like this. So they just said, screw it. Sekiro is a powerful shinobi. He can hold his breath for as long as he wants. And it works. In a game where supernatural stuff is commonplace and powerful people have abilities that border on supernatural themselves, there's no reason that I should have to interrupt my underwater exploration to come up for air. I'm really glad they didn't just arbitrarily impose that on players. It made a huge difference. When Sekiro first released, I saw a lot of discourse around the game talking about how it was unfair. Not just difficult, but actually unfair. This didn't surprise me because this always happens to From Software games to an extent, so I took it with a grain of salt. After having played through the game from start to finish, the mechanics themselves don't feel unfair at all to me. Sekiro is very challenging, there's no doubt about that. But as with every other From Software game I've played, the learning curve is high, but once I got over that initial hump, I felt like I started getting pretty good at the game very fast. Combat in Sekiro revolves around a combination of attacking, dodging, guarding, and deflecting. Deflecting is basically parrying. When you simply guard an attack, which is performed by holding down the guard button, you won't take vitality, which is health, damage from it, but you will take posture damage. Once you've taken enough posture damage, your posture is broken and you'll be stunned for a few seconds, leaving you vulnerable. Deflecting, on the other hand, requires a carefully timed press of the guard button right as an enemy attack is about to connect, and if successful, not only allows you to act more quickly afterward than you're able to after simply guarding, but also actually damages the enemy's posture bar. Once the enemy's posture is broken, it opens them up to a death blow. So basically, deflecting is always better than regular guarding, and you sort of need to get good at it in order to be able to progress easily. But the beautiful thing about Sekiro's difficulty curve is that, while it is fairly high at a base level, it also progresses very evenly. The enemies at the beginning of the game are fairly slow, and have highly telegraphed attacks, giving you ample opportunity to get comfortable with deflecting. The game throws a couple of mini-bosses at you in the first few hours, which are definitely tough, but they prepare you well for the first real boss fight, which doesn't actually happen until you've already been playing for a few hours. I was actually surprised at how long it took to find myself fighting the first boss, but by the time I was there, I felt very comfortable with the game's core mechanics, so I was able to focus simply on learning the boss itself without having to worry about controlling my character and making sure I was hitting the right buttons. Sekiro also regularly pits you against the same mini-bosses multiple times, but in slightly different environments or scenarios. Probably the best examples of this are the long-arm centipede and the Shishimen warrior enemies. The long-arm centipedes are these super creepy, weird humanoids that walk on all fours, are very large, and have claws fixed to their hands. They attack relentlessly, throwing lots of fast strikes at you over and over, so deflecting is basically necessary in order to beat them efficiently, because if you try to just guard their attacks, they'll inevitably break your posture. The first time I fought one of these enemies, I did so very cautiously, because that's how I, and I would wager most players, almost always approach any new threat in a From Software game. I tried guarding and using a hit-and-run strategy to slowly chip away at its health, but that didn't really work too well. So eventually I decided I was just going to try to get good and try to deflect his attacks. This strategy worked immediately, and I beat it on the very next try. Then, later on in the game, you encounter another long-arm centipede, but this time you have to fight him in a tiny, cramped area with almost no room to even dodge, let alone run away for a breather if you're getting overwhelmed. It's quite clear from looking at the arena before you even walk in that the only way to really beat him is to consistently deflect his attacks. But my previous encounter had already taught me that this was the optimal strategy, so I felt prepared, and I beat it on my first try, which felt fantastic. The other example I mentioned are the Shishimen warriors, which are spooky mini-bosses that attack you primarily using homing magic and have extremely high defense. Fighting these enemies is an endurance test, because there's no secret strategy to beating them. You just have to whack them with your sword over and over and over until you can perform a death blow, all the while doing your best to avoid their magical attacks. The first time you fight one of these guys, it's in a huge arena with a very large and conveniently placed rock pillar sticking out of the ground that seems very clearly like it's there to give you something to hide behind in case you're having trouble, because his magical attacks can't go through it. except the new giant Kamehameha attack he gains during phase 2 of the fight, of course. In a truly unfortunate turn of events, I wasn't recording the first time he used it against me. But what happened was I performed the first death blow and then immediately retreated behind the rock pillar to regroup and heal. Then he fired a giant laser beam that went straight through the rock and killed me. It was honestly perfect. I'm really sad I didn't get it on video. Anyway, it's a pretty tough fight, but it's doable because the laser beam attack is the only thing that changes in phase 2. It's just a matter of getting comfortable fighting him. The next one of these enemies you fight in a similarly huge arena, but this time there are no obstacles that you can hide behind to avoid his attacks, so it tests your previously learned skills a little harder. The third and final instance of this mini-boss takes place in a shallow river, a much smaller and more abnormally shaped arena that further tests your ability to avoid damage. Each encounter gets harder, but it feels fair because you're just using skills you've already honed over the course of the game. I will say that there were exactly 2 things in the game that felt unfair. The first happened during the boss fight with Genichiro Ashina, who appears to be the main antagonist of the game, at least at the beginning. This is a very tough fight that took me a while to get comfortable with and learn his patterns, but it's also an endurance test, because it's very hard to break Genichiro's posture or do damage to his health because he tends to guard most of your attacks, so you really need to be relentless and attack him constantly, which is scary against a foe this powerful. When you finally land 2 death blows against him, you realize that the fight isn't over, and phase 2 begins. During this phase, he gains a few new attacks, which isn't surprising, but these attacks also come with an entirely new mechanic. During phase 2, Genichiro gains the ability to imbue some of his stronger attacks with lightning, which does huge damage and can stun you briefly. At this point, the game gives you an ability called Lightning Reversal, which allows you to guard lightning-based attacks and then redirect them back at the enemy. The way it works is you have to jump before the lightning attack hits you, block it in mid-air, and then hit the attack button to send it back before you touch the ground. In retrospect, it's not really that complicated, but I was really struggling to do it because it was in the middle of the hardest fight of the game so far, and it gets introduced at a point where on most attempts, I had usually already exhausted most of my healing items and was fighting for my life just to stay alive. It felt a little bit cheap to introduce a brand new mechanic in phase 2 of the current hardest fight in the game, because you don't have any opportunities to practice it. This felt a little out of character for Sekiro thus far, because as soon as you finish the tutorial section at the beginning, you're very deliberately introduced to a character named Hanbei the Undying, an immortal warrior that basically serves as your practice dummy. As you unlock more advanced techniques throughout the game, you're able to practice a lot of them on Hanbei, which really helps. But you can't practice lightning reversal with him. So you really have absolutely no opportunity to learn this new technique that's only introduced to you during the final portion of a boss fight. It's not strictly necessary to win the fight, which I know for certain because eventually I just gave up on trying to learn it and started just dodging all of his lightning attacks, and that did eventually work. So I'm not sure if I would necessarily call it unfair due to the fact that I was able to find a way around it without too much difficulty, but it's definitely kind of cheap. The second thing that felt unfair was a mini-boss that you encounter a few times called the Headless. These enemies are very unique due to the fact that they have an aura surrounding them that prevents you from running or dodging, and forces you to move at a walking pace whenever you're near them. In a game as fast-paced and so heavily centered around freedom of movement as Sekiro, being forced to play at such a slow pace is very jarring, and it makes the fight a lot harder. That's not the unfair part though. The Headless are what the game classifies as supernatural or apparition-type enemies, which means that all of their attacks inflict buildup of a status ailment called Terror. The way status ailments usually work in From Software games is that attacks which cause a given ailment start to build up a meter when they hit you, and once that meter fills, you're afflicted with the ailment. So with poison, for example, you won't actually get poisoned and start taking damage from it until your poison meter is full. The thing with terror, though, is that once your terror meter is full, you just die instantly, no matter how much health you have. So in order to effectively fight the Headless, you need an item called a pacifying agent, which cures terror buildup and increases your resistance to it for a limited time. The only problem is that it's a consumable, meaning you don't have an infinite supply of them. On top of that, Headless have insane defense and take very little damage from any of your attacks. In order to do any real damage to them, you need to use an item called Divine Confetti, which increases your damage versus supernatural enemies. This too is a consumable. So basically what this meant in practice was that when I encountered my first Headless, I tried fighting it multiple times and failed each time, which is normal and what I expected, but eventually I ran out of pacifying agent, which made my chances of winning extremely small. I really wasn't looking forward to the process of farming these items from the few places they can be found, and it was a frustrating experience. It definitely felt unfair to essentially lock victory behind a condition like, you need to use a very specific item during this fight. Of course, this is slightly hyperbolic. You don't strictly need these items to kill the Headless. It's just way, way harder without them. So it wasn't fun, and I didn't feel like it was really testing my skills in a genuine way anymore. However, this situation actually resolved itself in a satisfying way. Eventually, I gave up on trying to kill the Headless and moved on, figuring I'd come back to it later once I had leveled up a bit and also found more of the items that I needed. But shortly after abandoning it, I came across a merchant selling an item called the Mottled Purple Gourd, which is essentially a refillable version of Pacifying Agent. It doesn't have an infinite amount of uses, but its limited uses get restored every time you rest at a Sculptor's Idol, which are the game's checkpoints. So it's limited in the short term, but unlimited in the long term. This basically solved the whole problem, because while there isn't an equivalent version of this item for the Divine Confetti, in my experience, I used Divine Confetti a lot less frequently than Pacifying Agent. So I never felt like I was in too much danger of running out of that. Plus, I also realized at some point that I could stack the damage boosting effect of Divine Confetti with Akko's Sugar, which is another consumable item that boosts all your damage across the board. So between the double damage boost and the Mottled Purple Gourd that allowed me to cure my terror buildup, the Headless suddenly became a much easier opponent. So yeah, overall, I can't really find any real justification for the idea that Sekiro is unfair. No doubt that it's hard, and if you're not used to playing hard games, then I totally get why it might feel unfair. But every difficulty that I encountered in the game had a solution, which is what I expect from Software. So obviously, I've been kind of raving about this game, and with good reason. I think it's a masterpiece, and it's one of the most fun games I've played in a really, really long time. There was very little I didn't like about Sekiro, but let's talk about some of the few things on that list. Like nearly all From Software games, Sekiro has a very cool story, but it's presented in a very abstract, non-linear way. If you've never played a From Software game, they don't usually have big bursts of exposition given to you in cutscenes. The intro cinematic at the start of the game will generally give you the major points of the overarching plot, but you need to seek out the story actively by talking to NPCs, reading item descriptions, and paying attention to the world around you, and sort of piece together the finer details yourself. It's a very interesting way of storytelling that I like because it encourages you to really get immersed in the game world. But I also totally get why some people don't like it. If you don't really dive into the game and explore it to its fullest extent, it's easy to play through a From Software game to completion and feel like you don't really understand what just happened, and that's not a great feeling. I normally don't mind this style of storytelling, but in Sekiro, I wasn't entirely into it. You see, Sekiro is a lot more directly focused on the plot than Dark Souls. There are a lot more cutscenes and a lot more dialogue, and that dialogue tends to be a little less vague and more willing to just tell you what's happening in the story compared to Dark Souls. It was refreshing at first, because for everything I just explained in terms of how From Software games tell their stories, that sort of felt like it wasn't as much the case in Sekiro as it was in Dark Souls. But as the game goes on, the larger scale story begins to get pretty confusing, and I definitely started to have that what's going on here feeling in the second half. My first experience of this was actually with the previously mentioned boss fight against Genichiro Ashina. You see, the basic plot at the beginning of the game is that Sekiro, the main character and the person we control, is a shinobi tasked with protecting the young Lord Kuro. As a shinobi bound by a code of honor, Sekiro's loyalty to his lord is everything. So when Kuro gets captured by Genichiro Ashina, The young lord's rescue becomes Sekiro's entire purpose in life. As the game goes on, it's revealed that the reason Genichiro is after Kuro is because the young lord has special blood known as the Dragon's Heritage, which essentially makes him immortal and unkillable. Genichiro wants to use Kuro's blood to harness the power of immortality in order to preserve the strength of Ashina, his homeland. The game presents Genichiro as the main antagonist, so imagine my surprise when less than 10 hours into the story, I was face to face with the man himself. It really seems like he's going to be the game's final boss, but instead he's the second boss you fight. I found that really shocking. Furthermore, after the fight, he escapes and completely disappears, never to be seen again until the very end of the game. In fact, there are multiple endings available in Sekiro depending on your actions throughout the game, and in one of them, Genichiro is completely absent. So if I had chosen to take that particular path, he would have disappeared after this abnormally early boss fight, and I actually would never have seen him again. In retrospect, I'm really glad I didn't choose that route because I feel pretty confident that I would have felt really unsatisfied by that lack of closure. The multiple endings in Sekiro are another piece of the thing I don't quite like about the game's storytelling. I'm not gonna sugarcoat it, man, all the endings are seriously confusing. From Software games always have multiple endings, although they're generally pretty cut and dry, with your actions throughout the story not having much of an effect, and the game simply presenting you with two options at the very end, each of which give you a different conclusion to the story. Bloodborne and Dark Souls 3 broke this trend, giving you the opportunity to unlock different endings if you completed certain requirements during the story. Sekiro amps this up considerably, with 4 different endings, at least one of which has a lot of extra requirements that I'm hard-pressed to imagine even a single person naturally did on their first playthrough. And that's fine. The point of including multiple endings in a video game is to increase replay value and give the players the option to do things differently on subsequent playthroughs. I'm not even necessarily annoyed by how elaborate the requirements for some of the endings are in Sekiro in a vacuum. That's sort of what I expect with From Software. It's just that Sekiro, on the surface, appears to present its story in a much more direct and straightforward way than Dark Souls or Bloodborne, but that starts to not be the case at all in the second half of the game. So I sort of felt like the game set me up with an expectation for how the story would go, and then just threw me a massive curveball at a certain point. It wasn't the end of the world, but it was definitely very jarring. And in a way, it's kind of unfortunate, because the story of Sekiro is really cool and interesting once you really dive into it. I just wish the game didn't make it so easy for you to miss some really big chunks of it. I mentioned this earlier in the video as something that didn't really bother me, but I do also miss the character customization that I've come to expect in From Software games. I want to clarify that what I said before is still true. I didn't miss it during my first playthrough. There are a huge number of opportunities for improving your in-game abilities as you play through the game. It's nowhere near close to possible to max out your character in a single playthrough, so it didn't bother me as I was playing the game for the first time. But after finishing my first playthrough and eventually starting New Game Plus, I'm starting to feel it more. Sekiro has light RPG elements in the sense that you can upgrade your character as you see fit throughout the game, but ultimately, every single person who plays Sekiro is going to have the exact same character once they've 100%ed the game and fully upgraded everything there is to upgrade. Now, we knew from the beginning that Sekiro was going to be a very different game from Demon Souls, Dark Souls, or Bloodborne, and mechanically speaking, it is. But from a general design perspective, it's really not that different at all. Even though the mechanics are different, it's still got all the core things that we've come to expect from Software. It is difficult to separate it from the Soulsborne games to the extent that I don't miss the character customization, but I also maintain that the core gameplay is fun enough that it's got a huge replay value even without this. Plus, there are a number of unlockable costumes once you complete the game. I don't think this inherently increases replay value in video games, but it's always a really nice bonus for games that already have good replay value. Of course, some of these costumes are locked behind the incredibly difficult Gauntlet of Strength challenges, which is a boss rush mode where if you die, you fail and have to start over. This feels like a lot to ask just for unlocking alternate costumes, but as we all know, nothing can ever be easy with From Software. There are so many things about Sekiro that I really, really loved, And I've talked about a bunch of the big concepts, but now I want to talk about some really specific things that I thought were great. The first really mind-blowing moment I had was when I used an ability called the Mikiri counter for the first time. The Mikiri counter is an ability that allows you to defend against thrust attacks in a unique way. When an enemy is coming at you with a thrust attack, you simply hit the dodge button, and if you time it correctly, a sort of semi-cinematic animation happens where Sekiro sidesteps the attack, then stomps his foot down onto the enemy's weapon, driving it into the ground and knocking them off balance. This deals a huge amount of posture damage, and it also has a much more generous timing window than if you tried to deflect. Aside from the fact that it's a great mechanic because it rewards you for trying to improve and do the optimal thing in combat, I mean, just look at it. It's so sick. It's not particularly hard to do, but despite unlocking it pretty early on, it remained one of the most satisfying things that I could do throughout my entire playthrough. Next up are the ninjutsu techniques. These are unique unlockable abilities that you can only perform after a backstab death blow, which is usually how you kill unsuspecting enemies while you're stealthing around. The first ninjutsu technique you acquire is called blood smoke, and it allows you to turn the enemy's blood into a big cloud of red smoke that obscures your position and makes nearby enemies lose track of you, allowing you to return to stealth even after killing an opponent in a crowd. On the other hand, you can also chain blood smoke usage, because after using it once, nearby enemies can no longer see you, so it gives you the opportunity to snag a free backstab after using it once. On top of that, it also just looks visually amazing. I had a really cool moment with this somewhat early on in my playthrough, where I acquired an ability called Vault Over. The way it works is, at any point during combat where you can perform a front-facing death blow, you can hit the jump button, and Sekiro will run up the enemy's chest and vault over them, landing behind them so you can perform a backstab death blow instead of a front-facing one. At first, I didn't understand what the purpose of this technique was. If an enemy is open to a death blow, there's no reason to get behind them and turn it into a backstab. They're functionally no different, so what's the point? I thought it was dumb. How foolish I was to think that From Software would ever put a useless mechanic into one of their games. Because shortly after acquiring Vault Over, I acquired Blood Smoke, and then suddenly it all clicked. The purpose of Vault Over is that it allows you to put yourself in a position where you can use blood smoke even in the middle of a big fight where stealth would otherwise be impossible. It's really genius combat design, and I love the fact that they made it so you get Vault Over before you get blood smoke, because it allows you to put the pieces together yourself like I did, which was really satisfying. Once you unlock Blood Smoke, you can clearly see that there are 2 more slots for ninjutsu techniques, but to be honest, I was skeptical about whether or not I'd want to use them. Blood Smoke is so cool and also so useful that I couldn't imagine anything making me want to switch off it. But the second ninjutsu technique you unlock is called Puppeteer, and it's really cool. It allows you, after performing a backstab, to force the enemy's dead body to stay alive for a few minutes longer, but under your control. Puppeteered enemies will follow you around and attack any enemies that they see, and furthermore, because they're already dead, they can't be killed, no matter how many times they get hit. This might sound broken, but it's really not, because number 1, it doesn't last forever, and number 2, in general, enemies in Sekiro attack pretty fast, and generally you want to use this ability when you're about to fight a big group, so puppeteered enemies will spend most of their time getting whacked around. This ability is less about using them to deal damage than it is about crowd control and distraction. Being able to take the attention of a few enemies off of you and direct it somewhere else is invaluable during big group fights. The first time I really understood how useful this ability is was during this one particular mini-boss fight. You walk into the room and go towards the mini-boss to start fighting him, only to be ambushed from the side by an enemy that was lying in wait, positioned just so you can't see them when looking straight through the narrow doorway. I died the first time, but on my second attempt, I crouch walked through the door, and even though the mini-boss himself saw me right away, the second enemy is conveniently facing away from the door, so I was able to backstab him and then use Puppeteer, which suddenly turned the encounter into a 2v1 fight in my favor instead of his. Another moment that truly blew my mind in my first playthrough was when I acquired the Mibu breathing technique, which I mentioned earlier in the video. I can't even explain my excitement as soon as I read the text on screen describing that I could now dive underwater. My mind immediately started racing, trying to remember all the different bodies of water I had come across thus far, and once I dove down into the water for the first time, it just felt like a whole new world had been opened up for me to explore. My favorite part of this whole process of exploration came shortly after. After exploring the waters in Mibu Village, which is the area where you acquire the Mibu breathing technique, I went back to one of the first big bodies of water I remembered finding, which is this large pond in Ashina Castle. In the waters of Ashina, you will often find large carp. Sometimes you find regular carp, which are enemies that attack you, and sometimes you find treasure carp, which swim away from you when you get too close. If you catch them and kill them, they drop treasure carp scales, which are a special currency that you can use to purchase unique and useful items from a specific merchant. So when I was exploring this pond for the first time, I was spamming the button that makes you lock onto enemies in an attempt to find any carp floating around that I might not have noticed, when suddenly I locked onto something that appeared to be below me, underneath the surface of the water. I swung my sword around, hoping to hit the carp that I imagined had to be just below the surface, but nothing happened, so eventually I gave up and left it alone. When I went back to this area after acquiring the Mibu breathing technique, imagine my surprise and delight to find myself getting attacked by an underwater headless. In retrospect, it's a little silly that I never even considered the possibility that I might later get the ability to dive underwater after first noticing that I was locking onto something below me. But I'm very used to water in From Software games being completely inaccessible, so it really never did occur to me. This revelation was particularly fun because I was totally not expecting it. Finally, let's talk about my favorite moment of my first playthrough. This happened during the Guardian Ape boss fight, which is probably my favorite boss overall, for multiple reasons. First, let's just talk about how it looks. Aesthetically, this boss is unbelievable. Look at its battle-scarred face, its deep, sunken eyes, its matted fur, which has patches missing from it. It's got a huge sword literally stuck through its neck that doesn't appear to be bothering it very much. This thing is obviously old, experienced, and has killed lots of foes in its lifetime. It has these massive, abnormally long claws on each hand, giving it a monstrous, unnatural look. And just look at the way it moves! I swear, if it turned out From Software had motion captured a real chimpanzee or gorilla for this boss, I wouldn't be surprised. The way he sways a little and slows down after moving on his hind legs looks just like real apes on the rare occasions when they stand upright and walk like humans. Everything about his physicality made me feel like I was fighting a wild animal, and he was unpredictable to match. The best part comes at the end of the fight. I'm gonna stop talking now and just let the footage speak for itself. I mean, oh my god, are you kidding me? That's not just the sickest finisher / execution I've ever seen in a video game, it's one of the sickest things of any kind I've ever seen in a video game. You see how I didn't move at all after the fight was over? That's because I was sitting at my computer with my jaw dropped, absolutely in shock. Everything about this animation is amazing. The way Sekiro twists his body to move the sword, the way it falls and stabs right into the ground next to him, the way Sekiro himself lands with his back facing the ape's body, it's just perfect. Yeah, then that happens. I said nothing and just let it play out here in the hopes that you too would experience at least a fraction of the absolute shock and horror that I did when it happened to me. I really wish I had recorded my real life out-of-game reaction to this. I genuinely did sit there for like 10 whole seconds with my jaw dropped after the execution, and then once the ape's body started moving, stood up and picked up his own severed head, I lost it. Seriously, I was freaking out. Notice how I didn't even really attempt to guard or dodge his very first attack, and then just started running away from him? That's because I was still sort of trying to process what was happening. I really can't overstate how well executed this whole sequence was. Up until this point, I had only fought one multi-phase boss in Sekiro, and that was Genichiro. It was pretty clear that he was going to have a second phase, because as soon as you land the second death blow that should finish him off, it immediately transitions into a cutscene, so that was a big tell. With the Guardian Ape, they give you almost no indication that the fight isn't over. There's no cutscene, the music stops, and the Shinobi execution message is shown, which you only see at the end of a fight. I suppose keen-eyed players might notice that the fog gate blocking you from leaving the arena doesn't go away after you kill the ape, which is definitely a giveaway. But personally, I was too in awe of the execution to notice. Either way, this was undoubtedly my favorite moment in my first playthrough. It's moments like these that are the reason I avoid spoilers so heavily. Going into this fight without knowing what was going to happen enhanced the experience more than I can possibly quantify. So, is Sekiro worth playing? I think the answer is actually really simple and straightforward. If you're a fan of so-called Souls-like games, 100% yes. It's a masterpiece. If you're not a fan of Souls-like games, the answer is almost certainly no. You'll probably find it frustrating due to its difficulty, and confusing due to its abstract storytelling and lack of guidance for exploring the world. Personally, for me, if you've made it to the end of this video, you know full well how much I loved it. If you're questioning whether or not you should give Sekiro a try, but you're worried that it might be too hard, I want to stress one thing over anything else. Sekiro is so much fun. Please understand that I'm not a masochist. I don't particularly enjoy failing over and over on the same really hard boss any more than the average gamer does. I'm also not some elitist who thinks I'm better than you for banging my head against the wall until it finally gives way. But at the end of the day, I love From Software's games because the core gameplay mechanics are just so engaging and fun to use and improve at, and I've never felt stronger about that than while playing Sekiro. In fact, I think I can confidently say it's my favorite game of theirs, and that's saying something coming from someone who has probably close to 2,000 hours combined across all 3 Dark Souls games. So if you're curious, give it a shot. Maybe you'll fall in love with it, and if you don't, well, I can't speak for anywhere else, but Steam actually has a great refund policy. Maybe try Dark Souls first, though. It's not as hard as Sekiro. Thank you very much for watching. If you enjoyed the video, consider giving it a like, leaving a comment, and subscribing to the channel. Hopefully I'll see you in the next one.